Good afternoon, dear friends. This is Ruslan Belov. Today we're covering everything, what's happening right now along the front line, and that night over Kiev that many people will remember for a long time. Let's start with the main story, the strike on Kiev, what actually happened. Last night, Kiev endured one of the most large-scale airstrikes of the entire conflict. Russia launched a massive attack on the Ukrainian capital from 1 in the morning until virtually dawn. The arsenal was comprehensive: cruise missiles, Shahed drones, ballistic weapons. But the headline was the deployment of the Oresnik, a hypersonic missile system used only once before, back in November last year, when it struck Dnipro. Now it came to Kiev. The Ukrainian side, as is customary, constructed its own version of events. According to Kiev officials and local media, the strikes were chaotic, allegedly targeting random objects. Markets, garages, residential areas, all framed as a terror strike against civilians. The narrative is well rehearsed, and there's little point arguing with it in public. But there is footage, and it tells a completely different story. Videos that emerged by morning show large-scale fires in areas where military infrastructure is concentrated. Things are burning that don't burn by accident. Strikes on the building of the General Staff of the Ground Forces of the AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine, were documented, and this wasn't broken windows. The remains of the building were engulfed in flames. A large logistics warehouse was on fire. Judging by the character of the blaze and the accompanying explosions, whatever was stored there was considerably more significant than household goods. Reports also came in of strikes on a National Guard of Ukraine facility. The Lukyanivka district deserves particular attention, a dense military administrative hub housing the Presidential Regiment, the State Customs Service Building, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, HUR, and a number of AFU command posts. That area, judging by the timeline of impacts and the scale of the fires, was hit especially hard. Russia's Ministry of Defense described the strike as retaliatory action, a response to the AFU attack on Starobilsk the previous day. Ukraine claimed at the time to have struck the headquarters of a Russian drone unit called Rubicon, but in reality the missiles hit a teacher training college. 21 people were killed and around 50 were wounded. The footage from the scene shows young women. There are no drone operators among them. Kiev refuses to acknowledge responsibility for Starobilsk. The retaliatory strike on the capital has been declared an act of intimidation, and Ukraine has promised to intensify attacks on Russian territory before the end of the year. Russia, judging by events, is operating on exactly the same logic. The broader point worth understanding here: the conflict has definitively moved beyond border regions and become a bilateral exchange of strikes against infrastructure and military targets deep in the rear. Both sides are aggressively scaling up production of drones and long-range missiles. This is not a temporary development, it is the new normal of this war, and the skies over both countries will remain dangerous for a very long time. Sumy direction, Russian forces push toward the forests. Now let's move to the front line. A great deal happened today, and we'll start in the north, Sumy Oblast. Russian forces are methodically building what they call a security zone along the state border. The logic here is fairly transparent. Russian command appears to have set as its summer objective the elimination of both border salients that jut into Russian territory. The Sudzha corridor, the one used by AFU forces to break into Kursk Oblast, is a lesson that nobody on the Russian side intends to forget. The plan, it seems, is to ensure that kind of incursion cannot be repeated. Today, advances were recorded along the road toward Bashevsk. All territory marked on the map has passed under Russian control. Simultaneously, updates from the Beselovka area indicate that Russian command intends to incorporate this section into the broader security belt along the border as well. But the most significant developments are unfolding north of Sumy. Several days ago, Russian forces broke through to Ivolzhansky, with street-level fighting already reported in the northern part of the settlement. Today the picture has sharpened. The Russian armed forces are expanding their zone of control south of Yunakovka across multiple sectors. In practical terms, this is an attempt to enter the large forested area before summer begins, to meet the summer campaign already under cover of foliage. This matters enormously. In dense forest, Ukrainian drones lose much of their effectiveness. Reserve buildup becomes far less visible, and small group infiltration becomes significantly easier. If Russian forces succeed in consolidating inside these forests, the AFU grouping defending Sumy will face serious pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Updates from the Myropilya area also confirm Russian forces expanding their zone of control there, reflected accordingly on today's map. Further south, in the areas of Turia and Ryazan, intensive airstrikes continue. Russian aviation is hitting both settlements with heavy glide bombs. Following the air preparation at Ryazan, Russian forces have been recorded advancing along the Korov River in the southern part of the settlement. Kharkiv border area. 2 settlements in one day. On the Kharkiv section, 2 points of change were recorded today. The first is Rybalkino, a small border farmstead. Russian forces took it today and are continuing to clear the surrounding forest areas, moving along the Vovcha River toward a neighboring bridgehead. The second settlement is Otradny. The backstory here is slightly longer. The village was originally under Russian control, then AFU forces launched a counterattack and claimed partial recapture. They were unable to consolidate, however. Russian troops expelled Ukrainian units from both the settlement itself and the adjacent forests. Today, Otradny is once again under the control of the Russian armed forces. Fighting continues at the bridgehead near Budarki. Russian forces already control the eastern half of the village and are steadily pushing out the defenders. Kupansk. The quiet is over. The Kupansk direction had been relatively subdued for some time, at least in terms of reported activity. Today that pause ended. Information came in confirming that Russian assault groups were spotted in a new sector. One that's somewhat unexpected, given the usual frontline picture. The corresponding territory has been marked accordingly in favor of the Russian armed forces. As for Kupansk itself, Russian command has not abandoned its efforts to shift the situation in the city and continues moving units across to the right bank of the Oskil River. However, fully clearing Kupansk remains out of reach. AFU forces are holding their positions and making effective use of the fortified urban terrain. Lyman section, AFU counterattack from 3 directions. Today's most event-dense picture is on the Lyman section. AFU forces launched a counterattack, and did so in an unconventional way, pushing simultaneously along several axes, clearly attempting to cut off the large salient that Russian forces built up over the preceding months. Pressure is recorded at 3 points. Near Katerinivka, Ukrainian forces were spotted and engaged. From the direction of Sviatohirsk, pressure on Yarova is ongoing. And today the western outskirts of that settlement came partially under AFU control. Updates from the nearby Drobyshev area paint a more complicated picture than Russian MOD statements suggested. Despite earlier declarations of full capture, after a series of Ukrainian counterattacks, control of the settlement is roughly split between the 2 sides. So across 2 of the 3 axes, Ukrainian command achieved some tangible result. But the third, from the direction of Rubtsy, turned into a disaster for the AFU. Russian fighters quickly identified the advancing reconnaissance and sabotage group and destroyed it completely. Every member of the group was killed, none escaped. Inside Lyman itself, methodical clearance continues. Fighting is ongoing in the areas of Khmelnytsky, Vatutin and Ukrainska streets, clearing the residential sector house by house. Russian forces have not yet been able to reach the northern part of the city. Simultaneously, the assault on Ry Oleksandrivka continues. The logic here mirrors the Sumy direction. Whoever controls the forested area north of the settlement ultimately determines who holds the settlement itself. Russian command understands this perfectly and is currently conducting clearing operations in those forests. To the south, small AFU groups managed to reach the outskirts of Nikiforivka from the direction of Lipivka. They came under fire and took casualties. Any talk of a serious offensive here would be an overstatement. This is small group infiltration, nothing more. Konstantinovka direction. The center is beyond AFU reach. No map changes on the Konstantinovka section today, but the ground-level dynamics are unambiguous. Russian assault groups were again spotted in the multi-story residential zone. Though multi-story residential zone is largely a historical description at this point. Estimates suggest that between 90 and 100% of structures in Konstantinovka are destroyed to some degree. This is no longer a city in any conventional sense. It is a system of fortified ruins. Nevertheless, Russian assault groups are pushing ever deeper into the central areas, and AFU forces are no longer capable of reclaiming lost positions. The core of Ukrainian defense is concentrated around the central industrial zone. Based on the overall trajectory, the southwestern part of the city will not hold for much longer. Zaporizhzhia direction. Eastern group breaks through the second-to-last line. Yesterday, the eastern grouping completed its protracted battle for Verkhnya Tersa. AFU forces were fully expelled from the settlement, confirmed by footage showing Russian flags raised across multiple parts of the village. Today, news arrived from the neighboring settlement of Zaporizhzhia. Russian armed forces advanced in the eastern part of the settlement and reached its central street. Looking at the broader picture, this is a systematic dismantling of the second-to-last AFU defensive line on the road to Kharkiv. The pace is being maintained. That means Russian forces could be approaching the city itself within the coming months, at which point what might fairly be called the decisive battle for Kharkiv will begin. One of the key nodes of the entire Zaporizhzhia defensive system direction, evacuation as a signal. The Kherson direction is a special case. The front line here has been anchored to the Dnipro River for a long time and has not shifted. But calling it dead would be misleading. It's simply a different kind of war being fought here. Not for kilometers, but for personnel and infrastructure on both banks. A few numbers that speak for themselves. Before the war, Kherson had a population of nearly 300,000. Today, the Ukrainian side officially acknowledges around 60,000, and that figure is likely inflated. The real population may be considerably lower. The city is emptied by a factor of 5. Meanwhile, AFU forces are actively fortifying positions in Kherson and regularly striking the Russian-controlled bank. This results in a constant toll on the civilian population on the opposite side, particularly in Oresnik, which sits directly across from Kherson. In the end, Russian and Ukrainian sides reached an agreement on the peaceful evacuation of approximately 6,000 civilians from Oresnik deeper into Kherson Oblast. From a humanitarian standpoint, this is a correct and timely decision. But in military terms, there is something more significant behind this agreement. The removal of civilians from a frontline settlement is, as a rule, a precursor to escalation. It is possible that Ukraine is considering a landing operation on the left bank of the Dnipro as a way of establishing a new bridgehead, and that this explains the unexpected willingness to cooperate on the evacuation. Clearing civilians out of a potential combat zone follows a clear logic. We're watching. Oresnik over Kiev. What we know as of this hour. Back to the main story of the day, the strike on Kiev, because information has continued to come in throughout the day, and the picture is gradually coming into sharper focus. According to data that emerged over the course of today, Russia employed at least 5 types of strike systems simultaneously against the capital. In addition to the Oresnik already mentioned, the strike involved Caliber cruise missiles, Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, and Geran attack drones in several configurations. This kind of combination is not accidental. Different target types require different munitions, and massing heterogeneous strike systems fundamentally complicates the task of any air defense network. That is precisely why the results were what they were. On the subject of the Oresnik specifically, it's worth dwelling on, because this system remains largely opaque even to Western analysts. The Oresnik is a medium-range ballistic missile in a hypersonic configuration, capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear warheads. Its defining characteristic is the speed it achieves on the terminal phase of its trajectory, a speed that existing interceptor systems physically cannot process in time. No Patriot, no SAMP-T, no IRIS-T can handle it, not because of any failure of design, simply because of physics. For Ukraine, this means that when the Oresnik is used, there is no defense, none whatsoever. It is also worth noting that Russia chose to use this system against Kiev specifically, against the capital, the political and military administrative center of the country. That is not a random target selection. It is a message, and it reads fairly unambiguously. There are no longer any zones of sanctuary. Ukrainian air defense worked at extreme intensity throughout the night. Official Kiev reports a certain number of intercepts. But what reached the ground, and the consequences are visible on video. The Oresnik was not intercepted. According to several sources, it is responsible for the most severe destruction of military infrastructure in the central districts of the city. In the diplomatic and military context, this strike placed Ukraine's European allies in an extremely uncomfortable position. Several European capitals requested emergency consultations through NATO channels. The American side confined itself to standard language about concern and unacceptable escalation. No meaningful military response followed, and none is likely in the near term. As many observers have noted, those who were so fond of drawing red lines appear to have run out of markers. What comes next will become clear in the days ahead. Ukraine has promised to respond. Russia, it seems, already responded in advance. That's the picture for today, dear friends. Movement across multiple front directions and a new level of escalation in the skies. We'll continue monitoring the situation in real time. If this material was useful to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. YouTube is actively suppressing the reach of military analytical content, and your support is the only way to keep this channel going. Thank you for your attention. This was Ruslan Belov.